Welcome, everyone. My name is Carl Van Horn. I'm a distinguished professor at Rutgers Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, and I direct the Heldrich Center for Workforce Development. Today's webinar is on lessons learned from New Jersey's modernization of the unemployment insurance system. And we're going to be doing that in two parts. But just a word about the Heldrich Center. For 25 years, we have been trying to understand, create, evaluate, and implement policies and programs that help people prepare for work and look for work. And unemployment insurance, of course, is a key part of that, part of the American social policy network. I'm going to be moderating the panel today. We're going to focus on this essential and really challenging question: how to deliver unemployment insurance benefits to unemployed workers who are entitled to receive them in a timely manner. Now, during periods of economic recessions, this task has always been challenging, and I've lived through and worked through several of them, unfortunately, as the ranks of unemployed swell and people are suddenly laid off by their employers without warning. Of course, it became exponentially more challenging during the pandemic-driven economic crisis, and was more complicated than ever before by the addition of welcome but supplemental unemployment insurance programs that were authorized by Congress during the pandemic. As many state governments confronted these challenges, they were often forced to rely on legacy computer programs and systems that had not been updated for years or even decades. In the first hour of this webinar, we're going to focus on New Jersey's Department of Labor and its Office of Innovation and how they met these challenges with agile, customer-focused processes to deliver better results. We have two really excellent panels of experts to discuss these issues. Their bios are included in the invitation, so I'm not going to go over them now. But our first panel begins with Michele Evermore, who is Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation and a visiting scholar at the Heldrich Center. She is a leading expert on unemployment insurance and previously served as Deputy Director for Policy in the Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization at the United States Department of Labor. She is writing a case study of the New Jersey experience and will be distributing that early in the month of July. We also have two members of New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy's cabinet: New Jersey Department of Labor Commissioner Rob Acero-Angelo and Dr. Beth Novak, who's the state's Chief Innovation Officer and leader of the New Jersey Office of Innovation. In addition, Waldo Jaquith, Government Delivery Manager from U.S. Digital Response, is joining us. Marcy Chin is unable to join us today. The second panel will be held after a 5-minute break that will widen the lens to assess the UI system and modernization efforts across the nation, and it will be moderated by Michele Evermore. That will include Ben Peirce, Vice President of Technology Services at the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, Rebecca Dixon, Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project, Steve Wadner, Senior Fellow at the National Academy of Social Insurance, Amy Simon, owner and founder of Simon Advisory, Jennifer Palka, author of Code for America, founder of Code for America, and co-founder of the U.S. Digital Response and U.S. Digital Service. These two sessions will be taped and subsequently will be shared with all of you who have registered for today's event. And as I said before, Michele's case study of the New Jersey experience will be distributed later in a month or so. I especially want to thank the Families and Workers Fund that provided some financial support for this project and this webinar. And I also want to thank my colleagues at the Heldrich Center, Lori Harrington, Liana Volpe, Kristen Bacani, and Heather Allen, for their excellent work on this project. So we're going to begin with Michele Evermore and to talk about what she's discovered in her research on the New Jersey project. Michele?
Thank you. And I want to second your gratitude to the Heldrich Center team for everything they have done. They're just fabulous. So in 2020, the number one thing that reporters seized on, I would say, was the broken computer refrain. I spent countless hours talking about UI and tech challenges. And I have to tell you, that's frankly almost a fraction of what we're talking about today. As people who understand the intersection of technology and process will tell you, it's never just the tech. Technology, policy, and systems are all tremendously interconnected. The slide I have selected to remain up while I'm speaking shows one example of the shift in user accessibility that has happened in New Jersey, but once my paper is final, you will see so many more. I see that there are many folks from other states on this call who are doing tremendous work. And the first thing I want to say to you is thank you for all you do. Today's examination on what one state is doing well, but I need to recognize that one incredible thing that came out of the pandemic for me was seeing how states were cooperating more and more and sharing best practices across state lines. As a matter of fact, my first week at the Department of Labor, NASWA put together an event for us to talk to states to find out how DOL and the Employment and Training Administration could best help states during the pandemic. And what I heard loud and clear was sharing good ideas across states. So that's what this is about. I came into this project because I got this opportunity to work with the Heldrich Center and was trying to figure out what to focus on first. And my friend Stephen Wandner, who will be on the second panel, called me and I, asked him, what sort of priorities should I look at? And he said, you're working with the public university in the state with consistently among the best access to benefits and the most appropriate replacement of former income and genuinely transformative technology improvements. And you're wondering what to focus on first. So into New Jersey I went. Before I get into specifics, let me take a step back to contextualize where we are now. When I was at the Department of Labor, Congress gave us $2 billion to fight fraud, promote equity, and improve timeliness in unemployment insurance delivery. Well, I think states have made incredible strides with the funding streams that have already gone out. We sort of saved technology modernization as one of the last things to work on because it's a long-term vision. It's a hard nut to crack. The 53 state systems are incredibly different. There's an entire book that the Department of Labor publishes every year on the difference in state systems, and that only touches the surface. For example, two different states may offer 26 weeks of benefits, but in state A, that means 26 weeks. In state B, it might mean 26 times the weekly benefit amount. So if somebody works part-time and gets a partial benefit, they may get more than 26 weeks of benefits. So even things that look alike are not exactly alike. So after I left, DOL came up with a nearly perfect vision on how to allocate these funds with significant partnership with the New Jersey Department of Labor, who is always there to raise their hands and participate in making things better, and also significant partnership with NASWA. But we were about to hit the debt ceiling, and some in Congress demanded a pound of flesh to raise it. UI technology modernization was a casualty of that fight. So now more than ever, we have to learn from each other and band together with best practices to make things as much better as we can ahead of the next recession and for the foreseeable future. While there are things that states can glean from New Jersey's approach, I also need to be frank in some of the ways in which New Jersey is a little unicornish. They have strong leadership from the governor, the Office of Innovation and Beth Novick, the Commissioner Robert Asaro Angelo, and the New Jersey Department of Labor Office of UI Modernization with Jillian Gutierrez at the helm. The legislature has been steadfast in passing claimant-friendly policy. The position of Commissioner of Labor in New Jersey is a statutorily relatively strong commission, and the actual commissioner is a firebrand. From what I have learned about New Jersey's process, folks in the right level of leadership have taken incredible amounts of time to sit in cross-team collaboration meetings that involve people who know UI, people who know tech, people who know finance, people who understand the legal ramifications, process people. And by sitting in these meetings, they've been able to clear the field and make quick decisions as blockers arise. Still, for states without the ideal current environment to move toward an entire agile modernization processes, there are things you can take away from this. New Jersey started this not realizing they were going to use the agile methodology for their entire modernization process. In the early days of the pandemic, the Office of Innovation folks saw the UI system was in crisis and just wanted to help. So they worked with New Jersey and found a place where they could be additive and not get in the way, which started with weekly certification. Well, that started a process. Just some of the initial innovation was helpful. Initial innovation spurred a partnership with the federal government. I was a Biden appointee, but we have invited an appointee from the former administration who helped with political leadership on modernization to talk about this. A system that pays the right benefits to the right people at the right time is not a partisan notion. It's just good governing. And UI modernization efforts in states will likely also span more than one political administration. And that's partly, that's another reason for this forum. It's important to realize that New Jersey DOL didn't set out at first to fully modernize this way. They learned along the way. And so, for example, at the outset, it might have been helpful to map out the entire system and prioritize tasks. So we'll learn as we learned from them. Panelists at this event today will walk through all of this. If you want a soup to nuts discussion of agile modernization, this is the conversation for you. If you want to know how to adjust leadership in an organization to pay good benefits, this is the conversation for you. If you want to do triage just to get yourself on a better footing for the next downturn, this is the conversation for you. And I'll turn it back to my colleagues.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Michele. Thanks for that great kickoff. Now it's my honor to introduce Rob Acero-Angelo, Commissioner of the Department of Labor in New Jersey. Also, I want to mention he's a alum of the Blaustein School for Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. I want to make sure I get that plug in. So Rob, take it away.
Thanks, Carl, and everybody for having me here. I'm super excited to be here. I'm actually right now in Minneapolis, Minnesota at a meeting of the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. And I talked a lot about this work yesterday amongst my colleagues. We're making great, exciting progress in creating an easier UI process for everybody, start to finish. During the pandemic, we saw how outdated and just a mess, quite frankly, the UI system is. It wasn't built for a national emergency, but quite frankly, anytime someone loses their job, it's an emergency for them, for their families, and their community. I spent many late nights and early mornings fielding calls and listening to the heart-wrenching stories about claimants in dire situations who can't access their benefits. And to be clear, this wasn't just during COVID. People, like I said, who are unemployed before COVID had many of these same situations. States have individually and novelly come up with solutions to meet highly similar needs across the country, upgrading mainframes and stitching together the implementation of new laws passed in the heat of a national crisis, fitting them into a 100-year-old statutory system that hasn't been updated to reflect the characteristics of today's workforce, then processing more than 30 changes to the rules during COVID and also battling fraud. Even today, with the national unemployment rate hitting lows we haven't seen in over a half a century, UI processing is still as challenging as ever on either side of the process, ours and the claimants. We know the pandemic didn't directly cause the issues we saw when millions of people were seeking benefits, only magnified them. The problems were there all along. And in a way, I'm glad we're finally in the spotlight about it. I wish Congress was still focusing as much about this as I was hoping they would be, but for another day. I've read article after article saying still the UI system as a whole across the nation is not prepared for the next crisis or the next recession, and they're right. But it's not just a computer problem or something we can remedy by a set of new computers or a new program off the shelf. We're completely flipping the UI status quo on its head by reimagining the entire experience, top to bottom, inside and out, for both claimants and, importantly, our agents. One of the reasons why I ran for my position at NASWA was I don't want to see my staff or the staffs of Departments of Labor across the country ever go through what they had to go through during COVID. The threats, the calls to people's houses, people showing up, making threats in person, all because they were in dire situations. I don't want our staffs to ever have to go through that again, or our claimants. I'm proud that New Jersey was chosen by US DOL and US Digital Services as a pilot state to lead the charge for a shareable and modular system and to create an example to unify the UI process for the country. It has a lot to do with the out-of-the-box solutions our department implemented to get $40 billion to nearly 3 million claimants since March 2020. And I can't give enough kudos and thanks to all of our staff in the Department of Labor, whether it be folks in the UI division, our IT department, communications, everything across the board. It was really a great sign of teamwork, and the fact that they helped me realize that we're going to get through this, and that we were going to do everything we could to make the current system we had scale to the need that we had during that time. In this pilot, we're working in chunks and using the agile method to ensure we can update and make changes easily along the way. We've established the Office of Unemployment Insurance Modernization to mirror the federal one at the U.S. Department of Labor, where Michele used to work, to be at the helm of our effort and to deliver a UI system that is reimagined, built in small modular pieces, and acknowledges in its infrastructure that modernization is not and should never be over. All the time we get asked, oh, when's it going to be done? When are you going to be done with modernization? And even for some of my colleagues, and I make the point that it should never, ever be over. We've learned an incredible amount from piloting the creation of a new initial intake system that will connect to our legacy mainframe. And we're excited to share that we've shared what we've learned with other states. This is opposed to creating a whole new system in one piece, which we've witnessed fall short time and time again across the country. There have been several states over the years, and even during the pandemic, who went for the monolithic overhaul of their systems because they felt like there was no other option, whether because of perceived procurement hurdles or lack of political will, spending millions of dollars only to be met with the very same problems. Far too often, as recently as the past few years, before and after COVID, states large and small spent hundreds of millions of dollars for new systems that simply don't work. Or maybe they get the job done at a bare minimum, but the experience for both the claimants and state UI staffs is confusing, frustrating, and quite frankly, demoralizing. The pilot program we've undertaken with USDOL mitigates this individual state risk-taking and helps us better align with how the private sector has built technology for decades. With a modular agile system, not only are we making targeted improvements where they're needed now, but we're setting ourselves up for the future success by building a new base infrastructure so we can continuously improve the user experience as we hear feedback from our claimants and make changes quickly to accommodate new policies. This means instead of having one big new system where we flip a switch and quite frankly hope for the best, we're breaking it down into workable pieces to give us the ability to constantly upgrade. Because as I said, we should never be done modernizing. And there's many aspects to account for on both the front end and back ends. We want to create a better experience for the claimant. We want to iron out smoother processes for employers, and we want to make things simpler for our own agents who use the system. Importantly, we've embarked on a claimant experience pilot to eliminate frustrations for those applying for UI, whether it's their first time or their 10th time. We're overlaying a new modular system on top of our legacy data so we can keep providing immediate service with our current mainframe while making huge outward changes for our users. We've replaced 38 questions on the initial application with user-tested, plain language, easier to understand wording. We've also added helper text where users suggested. We focus on advanced accessibility and mobile-friendly formatting. 52% of claimants are saying the new application is easier to use, and each are finishing the application an average of 47 minutes faster. We're concentrating on how we can best interpret the confusing federal regulations for the average New Jerseyan in a user-friendly and human-centered way. We're engaging with residents for feedback as they test our solutions. Our vendors and agents are sitting side by side with each other and with individual users to determine how we make this process better. We've sat one-on-one with Spanish-speaking residents to ensure we're translating correctly, word by word. Spanish speakers make up 95% of the callers in New Jersey who speak a language other than English. That's where we started. It's all part of our pilot program, and we hope to use the same efforts for other languages as we progress. I sat in on a user testing session in Camden recently, and it was really eye-opening to witness firsthand someone experiencing the process for the first time or even multiple times. It's all way too familiar for us, so having the view of someone who isn't as close to the process and who may interpret something completely differently has been a valuable resource for us as we seek to connect with each user on a human level, not just a faceless government agency. And let me just say, I know that user testing sounds like an obvious thing to do, but that is not the norm in the realm of UI modernization. We're updating everything from the application language and usability down to our correspondence to remove government jargon and make next steps clear. I want to really give a shout out to our partners at Office of Innovation, who've been incredible partners in these efforts, and our partners at the Office of Information Technology, helping us reword and reformat old mailings and old emails. Dozens of letters and emails are being overhauled, covering everything from dependency benefits to overpayment waivers to appeals notices. This effort is part of a larger plan to decrease wait times and give customers easy access to their claims, which is one of the biggest complaints we hear, that workers don't know what's going on with their claim or what to do next. Our updated website will allow claimants to check their claim status with clear information and self-service tasks like resetting a PIN or applying for an overpayment waiver. Previously, a claim would have to fill in 8 different fields to access their claim or 1099. Now they only need to complete 2 fields, significantly decreasing the chance for error. The way we see it here in New Jersey is that every time somebody has to enter any data of any kind, as simple as it may be, just increases the chance for them to make an error. The modular, flexible system we're building lets us make these changes and add new features down the road in a matter of hours, not years, as it would take previously. Changes we're looking forward to in the very near future include the ability to confirm identity verification status and review outstanding requests for eligibility information that keep their claim from moving forward, more detailed status updates showing where a claim is in the review process, payment history, which is really important, especially for folks applying for other social services, and other self-serve options to provide claim management capability to our claimants. All these tools developed with user feedback will reduce the need for agent intervention, which is really what people really complain about the most, not being able to talk to an agent. So all this work is about letting people have their own self-service, but importantly, freeing up our agents' time to deal with claimants who actually have a real problem that needs to be touched by a claims agent. Improving transparency into claim status, and this also provides more claims management tools to help ensure timely payments of their benefits. What we need next are serious policy changes in Congress so we can have a truly effective and equitable UI system. Equity has been a key word, an ongoing theme in all of our UI improvements, because what good is all this work if there are people who can't use it or don't know if they can? I've long advocated for national UI policy reform to make benefits more widely accessible and understandable to all workers, and to unify how states administer the program so we can better communicate and get workers the money they're entitled to quickly. This communication between states is really important for New Jersey, as we have many, many workers who work out of state. That just creates complications for them on a regular basis. We're rebuilding our UI system with user experience, transparency, and resiliency at the forefront. We're doing it carefully, thoughtfully, and deliberately, anticipating future needs along with today's. So it's my hope that the advancements we're making will not only spread to labor departments across the country, but that all government agencies will follow suit and make themselves more accessible and approachable for the people they serve. I appreciate you having me here today. I'm happy to answer any questions when time permits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Beth Novak, who's the Chief Innovation Officer for the state of New Jersey. She was appointed to the Governor Murphy's cabinet at the beginning of the administration, and she and her team work across a wide range of programs improving services and to the citizens and residents of New Jersey. Dr. Novak.
Carl, thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Heldrich Center for putting this on, and to Rob for his and his agency's phenomenal partnership on this effort. I had the misfortune of being on the press panel when Governor Murphy back in 2020 made what was actually a joke at the time, saying we need COBOL programmers to help fix our UI mainframes. That made it into the press far and wide, not just in New Jersey, but globally. I heard back this story because it resonated for so many people about the issue of government being broken and the need and the struggle that so many of us have had with so many systems and our ability to modernize them over the years. We ended up in this very unfortunate position, of course, because governments, as you've heard from Rob, at every level, not just when it comes to labor and unemployment insurance, but at every level and in every system, have historically not been investing in infrastructure, number one, and number two, taking that monolithic approach that he described, attempting to get something perfect, and as a result, never accomplishing anything at all, because inevitably stuff happens along the way, things change, and it becomes impossible to deliver the improvements that we owe to residents. So when an emergency strikes and we have changes in policy, whether it's the benefit amount or the duration, combined with the explosion of the number of claims that we saw during COVID, it was very hard in this case to translate changes in policy into actual practices. And in the end, how a website is actually built, how it's designed, may actually seem very, very mundane. But in fact, as we know, when it fulfills such an important function as UI does, when it impacts people's lives in the ways that you heard Rob passionately talk about, it really, really matters how we do it and what it looks like in the end. We thought to some extent we had learned this lesson as a community from the healthcare.gov experience. We thought we had seen what happens when we prioritize policy and we don't think about how we're going to implement it, and then the website breaks, as we saw it with healthcare.gov. What we didn't remember is at the beginning of that story with healthcare.gov, the way that project started was very much in keeping with what we did here. In fact, the fixing of healthcare.gov originally started with a small startup called Development Seed, that was brought in, not because they were hired as technologists, but because they had been users of the site themselves, trying to sign themselves up for insurance, and saw the problems and also saw the opportunity to make small changes that would lead to rapid improvements. And we saw the benefit already then of what was developing smaller improvements, the modularity that you heard Rob talk about, the agility of small sprints where every 2 weeks we push improvements into people's hands so that they recognize, realize, and enjoy the benefit of changes faster. So in order to modernize how government works, it's really important to take that Lego approach that he showed us. And that's what we really did here. It's not rocket science in many ways. It's about simply recognizing that this enormous challenge and this enormous knot of a policy problem called UI breaks down into some very basic steps. The ability for people to sign on, to fill out an application, to add information about their employer, their salary, the duration of their employment, how they lost their job, the ability to verify their identity, to then track the status of their claim. For us then on the other end to determine the eligibility of their claim and the amount of their claim, who their employer was, then to give them back their benefit and to be able to do that on an ongoing basis because of requirements of weekly certification. So when you take it and you put it in these very small terms, then it opens up the possibility of making small improvements, small projects that can be done one at a time to realize those benefits. So our approach really centered around a couple of key ideas here. I think first and foremost is a cultural approach. And you heard Michele say at the beginning that the technology is in many ways the least important thing, and I agree. It was the cultural approach to say we're going to trust the user. We're not going to view the user here as somebody who is somehow the enemy, but instead is somebody who is a repository of deep wisdom and expertise, who is, as users of these systems, is in the best position to tell us how to make them better. Equitable engagement, a human-centered approach, was really central to how we worked. And you heard from Rob about sitting down with users, both in person and online, people who included not only English speakers, but non-English speakers and people from our most vulnerable communities to help us to think about how to make this better. We used, of course, a very data-driven approach, learning from how people use the site to actually make improvements. And of course, making those improvements, as you've heard everybody say, and me now more than once, in an agile and an iterative way, putting improvements in people's hands early and often so that we can realize those quick wins. Working collaboratively, the White House, USDOL, NJDOL, the innovation team, our external tech talent, and of course, wonderful advisors like those at the Heldrich Center, everybody working together towards a common end, extraordinarily important. Leadership from above, Rob and his team, and the creation of the new dedicated Office of UI Modernization under Jillian's leadership, extraordinarily important, but also training from below. So the fact that Rob approved and supported training for much of his team long before COVID to learn methods of agile and human-centered design, that people were already exposed to those approaches, I think were extraordinarily important to the success that we were able to have here. So let me stop with that so that we have plenty of time for discussion and pass it back to Carl and to Waldo.
Thank you very much, Beth. Now we'll turn to Waldo Jaquith from U.S. Digital Response. Waldo.
Good afternoon, folks. As Carl said earlier, I will be your substitute Marcy Chin for today. Marcy and I are both with U.S. Digital Response. That's a nonprofit organization that supports governments in delivering critical services to the public by connecting them to pro bono technologists. So while we support all areas and levels of government, we've been working with UI agencies since April 2020 to help them increase their capacity so that they can deliver quick wins, and as they did throughout the pandemic, but also throughout their longer-term modernization efforts. So over the past 3 years, our unemployment insurance program has evolved with the needs of states. For example, we've seen increased demands for user research, and it's through that work and our focus on equity that we began to learn more about the challenges experienced by workers whose primary language is not English. Next slide, please. We all know that UI systems generally involve navigating complicated legal language. And so just imagine what this experience is like for somebody with limited English proficiency. So we've heard that claimants with limited English proficiency struggle to get through that application process because they get confused about how to answer questions and forms or what documents they need to provide, because they tend to have complex eligibility requirements like seasonal work or refugee status. and they're at a higher risk of being targeted for fraud and exploitation by predatory translation services, which is really dark. Next slide, please. So through our research and conversations with our state partners, we began to see language access as a real opportunity to help states improve UI delivery, and we recognize the need to take a multilingual approach in our UI work. So improving language access can benefit both workers and UI administrators by reducing the equity gaps between English-speaking workers and workers with low English proficiency, by relieving administrative burden for call center agents and for adjudicators, and even reducing the rate of fraud and overpayments by reducing the rate of claimant error that leads to those. The next slide, please. When we began working on language access with the New Jersey Department of Labor in December, they had a very clear vision for launching their new intake form in English and Spanish. They knew they wanted the translations to be in plain language, so it was critical to take the diversity of Spanish speakers in New Jersey into account, and that including feedback from their Spanish bilingual call center agents who would provide valuable insights into the most common pain points that Spanish speakers face when applying for benefits. So with these strategies, they saw an opportunity for even more people in their state to benefit from the initial launch of the new form. Next slide, please. We learned a lot from our collaboration with the New Jersey Department of Labor, which we hope will be helpful to share with other states. And so today I want to highlight 3 specific lessons. First, to produce effective translations, states should still think about how to leverage translation technology like Google Translate as a starting point, but it needs to be accompanied by competent human translators to review and edit those translations for plain language and domain-specific accuracy. Second is where user research comes in. I'd mentioned the importance of testing content with Spanish speakers from various countries of origin, but what was also great about working with New Jersey is they have a process in place for compensating research participants. Not only is it unethical not to compensate people for their time, but compensation also increases the likelihood of getting more inclusive feedback because you're more likely to have the opportunity to speak with people who may not be able to afford to take an hour out of their day to participate in a feedback session. And then finally, you have to engage your frontline staff in the process. Their insights and feedback are like having a cheat code for identifying common pain points for claimants early in the process. Next slide, please. So what remains? Well, thanks to our partnership with the New Jersey Department of Labor, we're able to identify a set of best practices for producing plain language translations and effectively engaging with claimants and frontline staff. And we've included some of these best practices on copies of the slides that will be distributed after today's events, but I won't go into those now. In addition to the work that we've done with New Jersey, we plan to continue working with states for a couple things in particular. We want to look at how to make translation content more consistent across the whole UI system to share those best practices, and then also to find ways to better leverage technology to make it easier for administrators to publish and maintain translated content over time. And our goal in doing this work is to help improve UI systems. We recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, but we would like to help more states take advantage of the work that's already been done in New Jersey so that ultimately we can see fewer people needing help from call centers, fewer mistakes submitted that need to be adjudicated by case managers, lower rates of fraud and overpayments, and then building trust with claimants by making UI websites more user-friendly to Spanish speakers. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, folks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paulo. Appreciate that. Glad you're back there, Rob. See your lovely face again. So let me start with you, Commissioner. Now that you've been through this process and your colleagues, I'm sure you've been sharing this around the country, but as you reflect on it, what do you think are the most important things that the leadership of departments and their colleagues should know if they're launching something like this or doing something different than what they've done before, that you could help save some of the anguish and pain that you experienced in New Jersey?
Thanks for the question, Carl. I also want to take this moment to say that, to be clear, we're in our second term in New Jersey. My job is safe, but I'm going to say that this would not have been possible with the support of Governor Murphy, because during the pandemic, there was a lot of pressure on governors who were getting crazy questions at press conferences, being approached on the street. In that first year of COVID, I believe 26 of my counterparts across the country turned over, mainly because their government did not have their back or blame them for the problem. I'm not realizing it was a national solution. So having that trust and space, most importantly, to give us the time was really important. And that gave all of us in the department space as well. So that it can't be understated that the leadership from your elected bosses as well. I think a lot of this is about risk, and folks don't want to have that on their shoulders necessarily. The UI system is so humongous, and it involves so many different parts of each department, that there's just so many different pieces that I think it's overwhelming to think I'm going to fix this whole thing by myself, or in my department itself. But I just felt like I saw no other options, especially during COVID, when other states who had recently modernized or completed their modernization were having the exact same problems that we were having in New Jersey with our 50-year-old COBOL mainframe. So it just sort of showed me, like, what was the point of doing it? And I get it, the political expediency sometimes of, there's a problem and you can come out to the press and legislature and say, oh, it's okay, we have an RFP out for a new system. And that's our answer to these problems. And we've just seen time and time again, as recently as the past year, in some states that are very close to us geographically, who've had a really hellish time launching a new system. I don't want to get to that, but it's just not, I guess I haven't seen anywhere else a better option. And while it's been very hard for all of our staff, I'm very clear that what we're doing isn't easy. Doing a method differently is not easy. It takes a lot of time and learning. I appreciate our federal partners for giving us the space on that as well, and giving us funding and willing to work with us. But it's not easy, but I think it's leading already to a much better product because we're so involved on the front end and at every step of the development.
Rob, isn't this the best time to do it right now when we have the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years?
Yes.
To be prepared for the next recession, which we hope is long into the future. Beth, similar question to you. I mean, you obviously done a lot of modernization and improvement efforts in your career already, and well recognized and respected for that. What was different about this, and what did you learn this time that you would want to share with colleagues on this call?
So let me say first that we stand at the ready to share with any colleagues from any other states, subsequent to this as well, lessons learned, et cetera, because we really want to be helpful in terms of evangelizing these approaches that we think are so valuable. So let me go back to kind of something that I said and just give a little color to it. So first, I think the important thing is just to think about how do you break down things in chunks, and it becomes so much easier. So starting right out of the starting gate with the fact that people had, for example, to certify weekly their eligibility for benefits. And they had, because of the tremendous load we saw during COVID, they had a 30-minute window in which to do that. So how do you tackle that problem? Well, you start by just ensuring that the site works really well on mobile phones so that when people are at work, they can actually do that function, using their phone to which they have access, or when they're on the road or somewhere else. Having a second quick win project, the intake form. And you heard Rob talk about our ability to reduce the time and complexity that it took people to fill out that form, which led in the end, because it was just simpler language, more inclusive, mobile friendly. We rewrote the questions. Things were really easy to do, frankly. We ended up saving people 47, 48 minutes per form, per person that it's taking to fill out that form. Building on that again to the next project and the next project and the next project, happy to go into more details about what those little components are. But I think, first and foremost, it's really taking that modular approach, number one. Number two, I think training is a really, really important part of this. You heard me say that the exposure to human-centered, data-driven, and agile approaches is really crucial. These are not things we know intuitively. It's not how government has worked before. So exposing teams, exposing staff to that kind of learning so that people know what these approaches are, what it means to engage with residents. None of us were taught how to do that in college or in graduate school, or frankly, in past work in public administration. So I think training is extraordinarily important here. The ability to blueprint what you're doing. So in other words, if you want to come up with what are those smaller projects, you have to have the ability to assess both what claimants are doing and what staff are doing so that you can find those smaller projects. That's what designers call service blueprinting. And so being able to see what those smaller chunks are is a skill that people can learn to do that kind of scoping. Having the right talent at the table, I think also crucial here. And where you've heard about the collaborators who were involved, I don't think that's, that's not an insurmountable problem for anybody who's listening here, thanks to groups like USDR. We have wonderful access to new talent thanks to collaboration now that's happening across states and with the federal government. I think there's wonderful talent that's out there, and talent also that can be cultivated within our own agencies to make these kinds of projects possible. And finally, let me just say the governance is important here. So the ability here not only to have that leadership from on high, but to have the kind of leadership that you're seeing from within the agency, the creation of this UI modernization effort that Rob has championed, having somebody who is an ultimate champion for this in the form of Jillian has been extraordinarily helpful. And of course, within my own team, let me just conclude a sort of long answer to a short question. To have leaders like originally Giuseppe Morgana and now Dave Cole, who have really been at the forefront of driving this effort from the tech side, and without whose experience and whose vision for this, I think none of this would have been possible.
Thank you, Beth. Michele, I'd like to turn to you with a question that, and you've seen a lot of modernization efforts around the United States. And one of the comments I've gotten, and I have too, but one of the comments I get from people that talk to me is, well, you have some unbelievably talented people in New Jersey, so no wonder you're able to do this. And you have a governor that supports us, no wonder you're able to do this. So don't talk to us about it because we don't have all that. Isn't that a bit of an exaggeration? Aren't there lessons here that, as Beth just said, there's a lot of talent in the country and different states that could do the same thing if they set about the process of doing that?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there are some states that are moving toward this kind of process. And I think that, the United States Department of Labor recently issued guidance to states about modernizing that very much follows the way that New Jersey is doing things. And I think that the biggest benefit for states is not having to solve every question before the process even gets started, which is what happens with some of these big modernization projects. I think the biggest challenge for states so far has been trying to think of everything that might go wrong before they even get started. And so they issue this massive request for proposals, and they issue a big all at once modernization project. And the difference in New Jersey is that as issues come up, they can solve the problem then, rather than try to think of it all ahead of time. And I think that most states, if they had it all to do again, would probably follow this approach. It's just so much more accessible and more workable for everybody involved.
Yes, Rob, I'd like you've raised your hand, so I want to give you an opportunity to chime in also.
Go back to your question about other states being able to do this. I mean, I think part of the importance of what we're doing, and be very clear, we're doing it in partnership with USDOL, with USDS, at certain times NASWA, is to make this less risky for other states to do if they don't have that kind of support or, quite frankly, patience. For example, when we launch our initial claim intake application later this summer, that's going to be shareable and usable by any state that wants to use it. I'm hoping to put in the chat, we have a now open source template for emails that go to claimants for 30 different reasons why they get emails, all about plain language, better accessibility in reading it. So there's the whole point of this modular process is about, and the important part of that is modular and shareable, so that other states can take advantage. So maybe they're not ready to do the full bore whole process over. Hopefully if they have a current vendor, they will be open to having them take on little pieces here and there. So we're hoping to show by this process that it can be done piece by piece, and you don't have to go all in. Say, for example, a state that just finished their modernization last year, so they don't have to start from scratch, but they can take pieces of our advances here in New Jersey.
Waldo, and that's part of the ethos of your organization too, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah, very, very, very much. And I just want to build on that last point to say that the status quo of how these systems are procured is extremely risky. We know that they fail at an overwhelming rate. If you're just going to spend, $50, $100 million on a system, your odds of success are vanishingly slim at that point. But that feels safe because it's normal. And so none of this works without the leadership of somebody like the secretary in a position to say, hey, tell me about this approach in which we deliver incrementally, in which everything that we deliver is based on identified user needs. Because that is, in fact, much safer by any definition. That is way less risky, except that it's different. And if you fail at a different thing, you get fired for that. It could be humiliating. But if you fail in a normal way where you just blew $100 million, but you paid IBM, so whose fault is that? You don't lose your job over that. So none of this works without the support of secretary or governor's office saying, yes, we're okay working in this different way.
Michele, you wanted to comment on the question that one of our viewers asked about legal aid interaction.
Yeah. So I think that this is part of the reason that this succeeded. I actually, before I went to sit down and talk with the Department of Labor, I'm an advocate. That's what I do. I sat and spent a day with New Jersey Legal Aid and talked to them about how they were engaged in the process. And New Jersey really took a proactive approach at making sure that claimants and advocates got a real say in what was going on. Actually, so I talked to Keith Talbot and Sarah Heimowitz at Legal Services of New Jersey. And I think I see Keith on. I'm not sure if I see Sarah. But they said that they actually would put together a spreadsheet of issues every single week and would actually sit down with the New Jersey Department of Labor for multiple hours and go through all of the issues that they've discovered in a week, whether it was technical, whether it was some access issue that didn't really have much to do with technology. They didn't necessarily sort those out. And then the Department of Labor would work through these issues with them. They'd solve 60 cases in a day, just going through their list. And so I just really wanted to, and I should have said this in my opening remarks, I really wanted to say that New Jersey's done an amazing job at engaging advocates and users on a very personal level. And I think that's part of the reason this is working so well.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. So what I want to do is just let everyone have a few moments to give their parting thoughts to all the folks that are on the phone and on the webinar, excuse me, old-fashioned. So let me start with the commissioner.
I'm sorry, I'm typing an answer as I'm speaking, but I would say one thing I wanted to say is that, during the heat of the pandemic, when I was, off and up with the governor at a press conference or maybe making a comment to the press, when I'd be trying to explain the process or talking about, make sure you take your time on your certifications, because at that point in time, 50,000 claimants a week were answering something adversely, which sent them to have to go to agent intervention. I was trying to explain the process to people to get through it. And I got always the response from claimants and from the press, quite frankly, and legislators was, "You're blaming claimants, stop blaming claimants." And they weren't, not that I was blaming them. I wanted to get them, but I hated that feeling. I need to provide information, but I don't want to be looked at by blaming. But I was blaming ourselves because the instructions were unreadable or ununderstandable for most people. The process did not make sense. The timing of the mail versus what they're getting an email, it was just all a mess. And so the work that we're doing isn't just about, building a new mainframe in the cloud. It's also about all these little pieces and every little chunk that we fix. It might be affecting a small portion of claimants in the future, but all those little things add up. And I really just, in my mind, there's like nothing that's too small to work on that's going to affect some subset of claimants or employers or your own staff that's going to make their lives easier. But really making the system more understandable for folks is a huge first step.
Beth?
Just let me double down on what Rob said, that no change is too small to make. If it improves somebody's life, it needs to be made. And therefore, these are very often changes that do not even involve any kind of advanced or mysterious understanding of technology. It's about changing things into plain language. It's about making directions clearer for people. It's about communicating with them about the status of their claims. There's lots of small things that can be done and can be done today to make those changes. I realize, though, that much of this may seem very opaque, like how do we do it and how do we get there? So I'll just close by saying that New Jersey is part of a consortium of states offering and supporting free training and capacity building to one another called Innovate US, where we teach one another how to do things. So I'm very convinced by this conversation and the outpouring of interest that we're seeing here, and can ascertain for sure that we will be offering some workshops that really get into the nitty gritty of how to do this. So if people would like sort of very much more hands-on guidance or access to some of those open source templates, or where do we start, we're very happy to help with that in our leadership in New Jersey with our state partners across the United States in offering training and support to one another for how to embark on this journey.
Right, and as you've said before, and Rob as well, all the work you've done is open source, so it is available for the asking, and that's extremely important. Waldo.
Just a few quick points. The first is that the purpose of the UI system is to center and support vulnerable people who need help on a defined term basis. You can't really do that without actually centering the vulnerable in how you approach that. And that means centering everything on user research. And that means language access, plain language, not just plain English, which is important, but also plain Spanish, plain whatever languages that your constituents need. And if you're not doing that, you're making a lot of trouble for yourself and the intended benefits. Second, you don't have to be New Jersey to do this. New Jersey, y'all are extraordinary. Don't get me wrong, but there is not a state or territory of the US that cannot pull this off. It can be done, and particularly with the help of, as was just described here by Beth, reusing the work that's already being done by their states. It's so helpful when it's open source. Third thing I want to point out is we at USDR have built a glossary. You can just Google for USDR Spanish glossary, or look in the slides that will be sent out. It'll be in our additional slide of resources there, with tested, documented, explained common UI terms translated from plain English into plain Spanish. You can just use them. Last point, we're here to help. USDR grant funded. God love our funders, including FWF, who's supporting this, makes this work possible. We provide those pro bono technologists to be able to help with language access and procurement and technology development. All of these things, we're available. See our website, usdigitalresponse.org.
Can't resist saying that many people in New York consider us extraordinary too, but in a different way, on the other side of the Hudson River. Michele, give a promo for the next session so people understand why they should actually, after the break, come back and listen some more.
Sure. I'm really excited about our panelists on the next session. I think we had a lot of conversation about technology here. I mean, one thing that the innovation folks that I've worked with, Giuseppe and Dave, wanted me to get across that this is still in process. The technology is not done, and that it relies heavily on good policy decisions that get made. And so the next panel is going to talk a lot more about policy, a lot more about process, and we're going to get some perspectives from across the country. I think that the most important takeaway here is that while New Jersey has done wonderful work so far, it takes a village to raise UI. This is not something that, one state can necessarily do all on its own, and we understand that. And we really need to talk about how do we best engage with each other, and with the federal government and with NASWA to really, get some of these systems across the line.
Thank you. So as we close, I just want to remind you that Michele's paper will be coming out, Coming Attractions, next month. We'll be distributing that to everyone that was registered for this. So we're almost 300 people registered for this event. And there were representatives from at least 28 states that I counted and when I looked through it. So we're very gratified that you've done that. We'll be sending this to you, and also a recording of this session will be available. So now we're going to take a 5-minute or so break, and you can stay on this Zoom, but we'll come back in about 5 minutes, and then Michele will take the helm at that point. So again, thank you all for joining. I know that I found it, and I'm sure you did, as a very valuable session. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it is 5 minutes after 1, and we can get started with this next panel. We have this panel is going to be, taking a step back from the intense focus on New Jersey and talk a little bit more about policy and modernization on the national level. We have with us 5 tremendous panelists that I'm so excited to talk with. First, we have Ben Peirce with the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. And special thanks to Ben for taking time away from the NASWA conference going on in the Twin Cities today. Next, we have the Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project, my former boss and current mentor in all things, Rebecca Dixon. Then we have Stephen Wandner, who is a national unemployment insurance expert. And as I mentioned earlier, was actually the person who pitched to me the idea of looking deeply into New Jersey's system for this project. Then we have Amy Simon with Simon Advisories. She was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training in the prior administration. So we're very excited to have her. And then we have Jen Balka, who is, the founder of Code for America, co-founder of US Digital Response, US Digital Services, and has a book about this work coming out next week. So very excited to talk to all of you. And so let's kick it off with Ben.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I just want to take a few moments and talk about the state of UI technical modernization as we at NASWA see it today. First, a little background. I've been with NASWA for 5 years. I've been involved in UI and UI technology for over 30 years, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Our team has been around since the 1990s doing technology work under the label of the UI Information Technology Support Center, currently housed at NASWA. As I think of the state of UI information technology at present, I look back at the history. We're a program that's not quite 100 years old. For the first half century or so, right up until about the time that I started my career in UI, it was largely a paper-based system, services delivered in person. And I think of us currently at the end of the 4th and about to start the 5th generation of UI technology usage. The first generation was the mainframe-based data processing that came to prominence in the 70s and the 80s. After that began what I call phase 2, generation 2, the idea of remote service delivery by telephone. Phase 3, remote service delivery on the internet. And phase 4, where we are today, starting in about 2006, is the integrated UI systems model. What I'm excited to talk about is how do we transition from phase 4 to phase 5, which is the modular, decoupled, interoperable, scalable, accessible, and equitable UI system that we like to call the Open UI platform. What is the Open UI platform? Briefly, it is the modular approach that we've all been talking about for the last hour with one key addition. And this is why the New Jersey experiment is so important to the evolution of the Open UI platform. The key addition is that there needs to be a creation of a trusted authority that works with all of the players, all of the states, the department, et cetera, to build the common standards and common definitions for interactivity between these modules and between states, the federal government, and other users. Hope to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. But meanwhile, Michelle, I'd like to turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much. Rebecca?
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk to you about UI modernization and workers' experience in this. We know that UI modernization is a critical step to UI access. So imagine that you're facing down a backlog in rent or mortgage payments, and you're wondering where you're going to get the resources to support your family's basic needs. You know you're eligible for UI, but you can't get through with your application. You need to wait for your password to come in the mail. And you have to get up in the middle of the night to get on the system to be able to get through or to dial through. That's what workers were experiencing. And UI is the only game in town with regards to substantial income support for workers when they're out of work. And workers of color and immigrant workers face additional obstacles to accessing UI, not even considering the technology piece. So we know that the pandemic really showed us a lot about this program. It laid bare the challenges that many workers were already facing, and all of those things were exacerbated by COVID in any way that a worker could be marginalized, whether that's race, ethnicity, gender identity, immigration status, all of those things were magnified in the pandemic. And this program, if this program doesn't work, it hurts all workers, but it especially hurts workers who are already facing barriers. For example, although there are civil rights laws that require translation to languages, we know a lot of states are deficient in doing that. And so workers have trouble getting through in that way. Also, the language is not plain and it's not really centered on workers and making sure that they have access. So use of clear language is important. And unemployment insurance websites, which I'm sure you've either heard or will hear, are not optimized for mobile use. And that's an additional barrier because Black and Latino workers are particularly likely to rely on smartphones for their internet access and to get through to apply for benefits. And we know that the job losses in this pandemic were historic and that state systems were overwhelmed just by the basic task of taking claims. And workers were frustrated. They were frustrated, they were worried, they were scared. But one of the things that we did see that's a positive is that Congress stepped up in a big way and expanded the program to include workers that are traditionally left out. And it added additional $600 a week to benefits, and later that was reduced to $300 a week. But these things were groundbreaking, and it brought in workers such as workers who are in low wage jobs who generally have wages that don't support eligibility for UI. It brought in independent contractors and gig workers. And all totaled, it was nearly $700 billion in critical expansions for families and children, and prevented 4.7 million people from falling into poverty, including 1.4 million children. And that's just looking at the year of 2020. And so we know how important this program is. And we had newly laid off workers who were confronted with jammed phone lines, crashing websites, long delays, and this really contributed to financial hardship for these families. And, the agencies are working with antiquated technology systems. They had shortage in staffing and resources. And all of these things came together as a perfect storm to really impact the way that workers experience the system. Many workers who never had collected UI before were left with a really bad impression of this program and inadequate support. And so we know that worker-centered technology, so when we're modernizing, really thinking about workers, what do they need? Not thinking of them as a captive audience, they just have to wait till they can get through, but really creating a system around their needs is what's needed if we're going to modernize this program and make sure that workers can get through, that this program can actually come through as a support for families to meet basic needs and to also bolster the local economies that they're in. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Steve.
Got my slides?
Oh,
yeah. Okay. I'd like to talk to you briefly about comprehensive UI reform. Next slide. The American UI program has been in decline for 5 decades, and now, at least in my opinion, it's broken and in need of comprehensive federal legislative reform. Our UI system, however, is a federal state cooperative program, and it varies state by state. New Jersey has one of the strongest state UI programs in the country. While the New Jersey program could be improved, I think it's a model for what states can do without comprehensive federal reform. In my forthcoming book on UI reform, I review the problems of the UI system, options for reform, and I make a series of recommendations. Let's look at just a few reform issues. Next slide. The key problem in the UI program is that many workers who become unemployed through no fault of their own cannot collect UI, even when they should. The recipiency rate measures the percentage of all unemployed workers who receive UI. I think that the state recipiency rate should average about 50%, but they averaged only 28% in 2019, varying from an abysmal 9% to 57%, with New Jersey at 57%. About coverage, almost all wage and salary employees are covered by the UI system, but an increasing number of workers are uncovered because they're classified as independent contractors, many of whom are called gig workers. Most of these workers are misclassified and should be covered, but most states do not cover them. New Jersey is one of the states that does cover them. Benefit standards. For many years, analysts have agreed that there should be at least 3 benefit standards that all states should meet. Their benefit replacement rates of prior wages, the maximum weekly benefit amount, and the maximum duration of benefits. While most states replace 50% of prior wages, because of the weakening UI system, most states pay low maximum benefit amounts, and recently, some states have reduced their maximum duration below 26 weeks. New Jersey replaces more than 50% of prior wages, has a maximum weekly benefit amount that's about 56% of the New Jersey weekly wage, and pays a maximum duration of 26 weeks. Next slide. A major reason for many states paying low benefits to few workers is because UI financing is so inadequate. The key financing issue is the inadequacy of the federal UI taxable wage base. The taxable wage base should be at least 30 to 50% of the Social Security taxable wage base. And you have to remember that the taxable wage basis of UI and Social Security started at the same level. The Social Security taxable wage base, however, increases every year and is $160,200 this year. The UI taxable wage base has not been increased since 1983 and is stuck at a regressive and ridiculous $7,000. States are free to raise their taxable wage base above the federal level, but most haven't raised their bases by very much. The New Jersey taxable wage base is $34,000 compared to a national average of $19,000. And last, the employee tax. I believe it's critical to have employees pay a portion of the UI tax to have a viable UI system politically. The employee tax, I believe, should be 30 to 50% of the total UI tax. Unfortunately, however, only 3 states have employee taxes, and only New Jersey has a substantial tax, which was the employee tax was 37% of the total UI tax in 2019. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that context. That's really helpful. Turning now to Amy Simon.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to the panel today. And I've just used these few minutes to focus on 2 themes under sustainability and success. But before that, a bit of context. So Michele referenced that I did work in the previous administration. So I was Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Employment and Training Administration during the time that the pandemic started, during the CARES Act and the following legislative vehicles in 2020 and early 2021. And so I deeply understand what many of you who worked in states were facing from a different level. I certainly did not experience it in exactly the same way. But then after I left the administration and became unexpectedly unemployed, I also became a claimant. And so in the space of 13 months, I had both a federal perspective and then was myself filling out the forms and horrified, quite frankly, at both the wording of the questions, the lax security standards. And so long story short, Michele and I have connected in the time since, and I'm delighted to be here. So the first point on sustainability is that I think modernization policy funding on the operations front especially requires bipartisanship. So modernizations take more than one political moment to accomplish, and the sort of large scale turning of the ship that I think the federal level is in the midst of trying to navigate is certainly going to take longer than one political moment. So the history of even the $2 billion that was in the American Rescue Plan Act was in some sense started during the Trump administration. So we had asked Congress in different vehicles at different points during 2020 for a large infusion of cash specifically for technology modernization as well. And so it didn't happen in 2020, but it ended up happening in 2021. And I think some of the work that turned into the Office of UI Modernization, some of the work inside the Office of Unemployment Insurance, those ideas had already been bubbling inside the department. And so I think that speaks to the fact that even if we have different policy views about perhaps what the federal state partnership looks like and what should be a priority on UI policy, I think there is and remains bipartisan agreement that the service delivery should not be in question. And I think there's a shared understanding, because the pandemic pain was bipartisan, that these solutions likely need some bipartisan energy going forward. And UI has a long history of being in the spotlight during a crisis, and then as the crisis passes, becoming less of a priority. We forget about it, we put it on the back burner. And I think that is some of what we've seen recently, but I think that also speaks to the need to establish a bipartisan way of talking about UI modernization that is inclusive enough to not alienate people based on perhaps differing policy choices within the community. Obviously, technology and policy are right next to each other, so it's very difficult to extricate them. But I think especially focusing on the Venn diagram, where the policy or the technology improvements are fairly policy neutral or policy agnostic in some way, I think is the best chance to ensure that sustainable funding and sustainable support for these sorts of efforts can be maintained. And that's certainly true even at the state level, even though that hasn't necessarily been where I've been invested. So the second piece is success. So in the wake where we sort of are in this post-pandemic moment, I think our lessons learned are still unfolding. Some are obvious, some are still being learned. But I don't think we can shy away from the good, the bad, and the ugly of the last 3 years. And I think there's often an incentive to ignore the parts of the pandemic experience that are not particularly helpful to my policy views or to someone else's policy views. And I think we have to tell the truth about everything that has happened in the last 3 years. That includes customer experience and that includes fraud. And I think there's often been emphasis in one way or the other, depending on perspectives, and we have to talk about both. And lastly, I would say on that point, again, having been a claimant and having been at the federal level, customer experience is non-negotiable. This is not something that I think is an option, but the program also has more definitions of success than customer experience. And I think we would be wise to think about the ways in which we measure the program's success. Customer experience is one slice of that, but it's not the whole picture. And I don't want good customer experience for those who are trying to defraud the system, right? I want terrible experience for them. I want them to not be able to access the benefits meant for eligible workers. And so I think focusing on improving customer experience in the holistic view of what it means to have an unemployment insurance program that works, that to me is the magic combination. So thanks again, Michele, for the invite.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your service. And now we turn to Jen Pelka. Welcome.
I am so delighted to be here. It's been really invigorating and inspiring to hear everything everyone has said so far. I've just wanted to be applauding, and it's just so hopeful. Michele knows that I knew nothing, next to nothing about unemployment insurance until July of 2020, when Governor Newsom asked me to come help with the backlog in California. And she knows that I relied on her to teach me some of what I now know about how UI works. I did have some experience with other benefits. And then I learned more because I decided to write about it in my book that's coming out next week. And it turns out there is an endless amount that one can learn about UI. And I had the privilege of joining Michele on a visit to New Jersey. So I know we're not supposed to be talking specifically about New Jersey on this panel, but I would like to touch on it a little bit. But I'm particularly delighted to be here because what I've heard on both these panels are strategies and tactics that I have seen work in other government services. So the fact that they are succeeding in New Jersey, I just want to add that I think they succeed in other areas as well. And though it's always a rocky path, I encourage you to take inspiration, not just from New Jersey and other states, but more broadly. What I saw in New Jersey started certainly with leadership, and I don't need to say much more about that because it certainly has already come across in Beth and Rob, the Commissioner Saro-Angelo's speeches here. But I think just the specific thing that I hear that I want others to do in other states is be in the meetings. Show up. I think that Rob and Jillian were in meetings where their peers often don't attend, and they're there to make decisions and clear the path. That's just one of many things. People talk about collaboration. I saw collaboration there, but not just across different functions or departments, across policy, tech, between the tech people who came from the innovation office and the tech people in the state. And one of the most exciting things was to hear folks that had worked in state IT for many, many years talk about how their approach and their knowledge of the systems married actually quite well with the approaches that the Office of Innovation, led by Beth Novak, had sort of introduced, and how excited they were to be able to serve the public better because of those approaches. Ultimately, though, I think what I see is people taking responsibility, leadership taking responsibility. There is a very common phrase that's said in government technology contracting, which is let's have one throat to choke. Sometimes it's more than one, but big contracts that go to a small number of companies because, and also often with very large budgets, so that it's easy then to say that we've done everything we could. We've spent the money and we've hired the people. But what I saw in New Jersey was an organization that had the capability in-house in order to be able to contract out well. There's a saying from my work in the Defense Department, which doesn't sound relevant to this, but you'd be surprised how relevant it is in terms of getting through bureaucracy. Software is not something you buy, it's something you do. And I saw a team that was really able to do that. And I want to recognize that it can be very hard to build the capabilities and competencies in-house because of the way this work is funded, the ways it's overseen, the structures under which it happens. And so what I'd like to help with, I think, over the next year in any way that I can is changing that environment so that we can invest in the proper operating expense to get what we need out of our capital expense. We need people around the UI world to say, yes, let's fund the kind of work that Michele has so beautifully articulated in her description of New Jersey's work. Rather than these big bangs that we hope are going to pay off in 10 years. So we need a level of advocacy that I think this community hasn't had. We need to ask for support from the folks who constrain how the work is done. And I'd like to offer another angle on UI reform. that is focused on delivery rather than or on delivery as well as policy, and how the policy impacts the delivery. I was shocked at how complex unemployment insurance regulations are when I was working with California. There's a story I tell in the book of my colleague working with a claims processor who kept saying, "I'm the new guy. I'm not sure how to answer that. Let me check. I'm the new guy." And she finally asked him how long he'd been there. And he said, "I've only been here 17 years. The folks who know how this really works have been here for 25 years or more." And as much as there was anger flying around in California at the EDD for not being able to get those claims out the door, I don't think those people understood the conditions under which those claims processors were working. And the fact that you simply could not create new claims processors in a crisis because it takes 25 years to become one. And without that understanding, it was very hard to know for people to understand why the checks weren't just coming out the door a week later. That's another area where I hope UI reform goes to is, can we simplify that? Can we get that down? You should be able to bring people on and train them and be able to deliver. So I'm going to end with a quote from Mike Bloomberg, who recently said, "We conflate the budget to do something with the capacity to do something." I see states now that are working on that capacity first and foremost. And I know that budget constraints can be a real problem, but the working on that capacity seems to be the way to use the budget as best we can. And where we are still making big investments, I would ask that we go look at how to build that capacity before that investment goes out the door. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for coming with me to New Jersey and helping me to translate. I am not a technologist, and it takes a lot of people all in the same room to figure this stuff out.
I didn't need to translate for you at all. You got it all.
So I want to take it back to the question of policy here. That word is doing a lot of work, right? Policy can mean anything from how many weeks do people get benefits, to what are good cause quits, to what questions do we ask? How do we ask them? How do we batch processes? Those are actually all sort of policy questions. And so when we say policy, we're talking about a lot of things. And I feel like that word does a little too much work. But I wanted to sort of start with something that Rebecca raised that I think we could get a little bit more deeply into, which is, how important are modernization efforts on getting benefits to workers who are traditionally marginalized, and why is that important? And maybe I'll start with Rebecca and then let other folks chime in.
So, Michele, one of the things that is critical to understand about the unemployment insurance program, which turns 85 this year, is that it was not created to serve all workers. And it certainly wasn't created or optimized for this labor market where we have folks working part-time jobs, people who are in gig work, and all types of different ways that they're interfacing with the labor market. And the way the program was designed, it was designed to serve, white male able-bodied workers who were temporarily laid off and called back. And now we have permanent layoffs and a much more diverse workforce. And there hasn't been a substantial update to the unemployment insurance program, to the eligibility and access. And so the workers who weren't baked in the beginning have a harder time and do tend to access UI at a lower rate. And so the technological challenges are on top of that. So if we're talking about the digital divide, that's on top of already having these other ways in which you're kind of excluded from the program.
Great. Does anybody else want to chime in? One thing I just would like to lay out for all of the participants is that a good foundation for some of the policy questions we're talking about here are included in a bipartisan commission from 1996 and one from 1980. I would encourage folks who aren't familiar with the recommendations of those commissions to go check them out. There's some really solid ideas there. Getting to the next question, one of the things I talked to Ben Peirce about was one of the issues that legal aid raised with me was claimants only get their determination, used to only get their determination once by mail because of the way that things were batched. And Ben had said, well, we solved that in Wisconsin years ago. Can we talk a little bit about, and this is sort of for Ben, but for everybody, about why it's really important to have states coordinate with each other in figuring out solutions that are shared across state lines?
Sure, Michelle, thank you. One of the things that NASWA primarily exists to do is to convene states, not only in the UI space, but of course across workforce, to share those promising practices and those best practices. So when we had that conversation, Michelle, I was surprised that the state in question was struggling to generate electronic correspondence out of a mainframe print shop. That actually can be done, and we had a great conversation about that. And that's just an example of one state having done something that another state struggles with that we need to be able to surface more effectively.
Great. Does anybody else want to sort of speak to that, the importance of sharing information across state borders? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say one snippet. I think the feedback loops between state and federal and between states, they're both really important. And I think, especially in this post-pandemic moment, is a really important time to do some of that information sharing. And I think a lot of those bonds have gotten stronger over the past 3 years between states. And so I think it's a really opportune time for that kind of best practices sharing.
Great. And specifically, Amy, having been involved from early days in the New Jersey process, what are some of the key takeaways from what you learned there that other states can put into practice?
Well, I don't know that I had direct insight into New Jersey. I mean, I knew work was beginning, but I think one thing that I will say is that modernization does require an ecosystem of factors to sort of be in place. And I think we've heard that in practice over both panels. It's not just technology, it's leadership, it's sustainable funding, it's procurement expertise. There's a whole range of things that I think are necessary to be in place for a modernization to have the best chance of succeeding. And I think even the conversation about agile, like that vision, the way agile software development works or modernization works has to be a shared understanding across non-technical and technical resources. And that takes education for folks that maybe are used to doing policy and working with their IT resources in a certain way. And so I think, I just think a broader sense of like what has given modernizations the best chance to be successful. There are always going to be challenges no one sees coming. So what can we do? What do we know? And I think this New Jersey experience has demonstrated some of those things in practice.
Great. Getting back to some of the policy drivers, Steve, you raised the high access to benefits, the high replacement rates. What would be your explanation of how New Jersey got to where it is in terms of benefit sufficiency and good access? You're on mute. Let me try to unmute you. Oh, there we go.
Hi. There are so many things. I mean, the UI system is under federal law, gives states so much flexibility with respect to the legal system. And I pointed out when I spoke, a number of the statutory provisions in New Jersey, but there are all kinds of administrative determinations that have been made. I mean, we've been talking mostly about computer systems, but when you look at access, and the reason why New Jersey has such the highest rate of access, I mean, a lot of it depends on the people, the leadership, what's happening in local offices. I mean, the fact that New Jersey allows the filing for benefits locally as well as by telephone and by computer. I mean, there are some people who are fine with computers. I ran an experiment in New Jersey so long ago, I don't want to talk about it. But we set up a place where people could get on computers and do all their search for work and do all kinds of things. And engineers would come in and they would get on the computer and they would do everything they had to. But you know, a lot of people were not able to do that. So we need a lot more in-person support, but that doesn't exist. When I was in unemployment insurance, when we went to telephone claims taking, we thought that unemployment insurance could be a telephone on the wall of a local office. I mean, I think that's just not a practical system, and we need support in the local office as well as by telephone and having excellent computer systems.
That's so true. So my next question is first for Jen and then for Rebecca. Let's take a step outside of unemployment insurance for a minute and talk about lessons that unemployment insurance can learn from other programs. And first, Jen, I know you've worked on a lot of technology modernization outside of UI, and Rebecca, UI is not the only issue that you handle with the National Employment Law Project. So I'm just wondering, first from Jen, technologically, what can we learn from other programs, and then Rebecca, policy-wise, what can we learn from other programs to make things more equitable?
I was thinking about this while Steve was talking. I think there's a really big difference between something like an unemployment insurance application that's been put online that feels daunting to those who don't use digital in their daily lives, and something like covidtest.gov, which is also online. But does everybody remember that? It came out at the beginning of the Biden administration. It took about I timed myself. It took 11 seconds for me to order my tests. They came immediately. And it's certainly not a fair comparison, except that it could have been much, much bigger. The people who made that website, which they made, I can't remember if it was 3 weeks or 6 weeks, but the difference doesn't matter that much relative to the normal time frame for developing government services. It's still quite small. The people who were assigned to, get that out the door could have chosen to ask far more questions. They could have asked for, health insurance information, vaccination status, household size. And they chose to make it as simple as it possibly could be. And I do think that that's an example of an online form that pretty much anybody could use if they had access to a computer. There are certainly people who don't, but those who just feel like, okay, this is going to ask me a lot of questions, I'm not going to know where to hit the submit button, that is not necessarily inherent to digital. It's a question of how it's designed. And I do get back to this question of, if it takes 25 years to learn the policy, that is going to result in a more complex application form for users. I'm excited about the work that has been done to make all this easier. Like when you user test questions, and more people understand what you're asking and how to get that answer correct, it streamlines everything. It makes things ever better for everyone. But ultimately, you're limited. How many questions can you take off of that form? Do people actually have access to the information that you want them to fill out? You know, their wage data or whatever. I don't want to compare apples. I want to make sure we're not comparing apples to oranges when we talk about digital, because there can be a huge difference, and that difference is design, but the policy is going to have to come along. Can I tell one quick story about when we were in New Jersey, or am I going on too long?
Go for it.
And apologies, I don't think this was told earlier, but one of the things one of the designers was doing in New Jersey was taking some of the notifications, either the paper forms or the emails that claimants would get either through the process or if their claim was being adjudicated or appealed, and feeding it into ChatGPT and saying, rewrite this so I can understand it better. Now, she had been doing this before ChatGPT came out. She had been taking these complex notices, reading them, trying to understand them, working with an amazing policy team who clearly loved collaborating with her, and simplifying them and then redesigning them. So, you know, you must call this number by this date is in big black letters and people don't miss it, that kind of thing. And when ChatGPT came along, she said, maybe this can help me do it faster. And I believe, if you recall, Michele, she said something like she was getting through them about 5 times faster than she had before. And it's not because she was relying on ChatGPT to write them. She would take what ChatGPT gave her and then go back through it and work with the policy team. There was a very heavy human input here. We're not talking about adding these off to machines, but that's a great example of using technology to make a program that's really obscure to the outside world make sense to people. My fear with AI is that we're going to let it substitute for the need to simplify it so it makes sense to people without that help. We should not rely on AI to just cover up for the fact that the stuff is too complex. But I was also just struck that she didn't wait for a policy. She didn't wait for training. She just said, this is a tool that might help me make this make more sense to the people who are trying to use the program. And she dove right in. And I'm not an AI advocate, but I am an advocate of people not being scared to try new things and use them with the right goals.
Yeah, I think at some point in the future, we should all convene for a conversation about what to do when AI takes all of our jobs, but that's a whole other day.
Yeah.
So yeah, Rebecca, what do you think we could learn from other policy areas?
Sure. So I can also share a story. So one of my jobs prior to law school, I worked in a call center for IBM employee benefits. And a big part of the training was the metrics that we had and the metrics that they were staffing us towards of, you know, answering the call within X number of seconds and, you know, having people be on hold no longer than X, whatever. And, you know, we manage what we measure. And we don't really have that kind of performance standards, whether it's related to customer service or even like percentage of folks accessing benefits. And so we haven't said that that's our goal. And so then the fact that our systems don't actually, or our policy goals, the policies don't reflect those goals. So the fact that we're not moving in that direction is actually not a surprise. And so there are other programs in the federal government that do have metrics around access or metrics around customer service. And so thinking about what are those that are an analog to this system. And then I would just say clearly, not an unfunded mandate for states. So making sure that they have the resources and that we're actually setting them up for success around any kind of performance standards is critical. And then a second piece of this answer, I think of a program like Social Security, which, you know, imagine if you apply for Social Security and then your employer like filled out a piece of paper and you got denied. Like that's the kind of thing that happens in UI, because the way the financing is set up, is it pits employers against workers in terms of your rate goes up if the employee collects UI versus Social Security, where you've paid into it and also there's no impact to your employer if you actually receive the benefits. And so we really should also think about the root cause of some of these reasons why the program doesn't work as well, if we've actually set it up in a way where it's sort of chronically underfunded, or where the revenue source is, kind of set up in a way that discourages, employers from wanting workers to actually access it. And so that's one of the things I think too. And there are probably other lessons from how Social Security works in a way that it is much more universal in terms of access.
Great points. So one final question, first for Ben and then for Amy. I want to get both of your take on, obviously not every state is going to do the soup to nuts agile modernization process. There's going to, and there's room for, states to take on more or less of the full modernization process. But what do you think are key takeaways for other states from what New Jersey is doing here?
Thanks for the question. I think the first consideration a state should make when considering doing a modular approach, an agile approach, is to determine which aspects of their current system are their most acute pain points. You can do that alone, of course. There are lots of methodologies like value stream mapping and so on and so forth. And you could, of course, work with entities like UIHC or USDR to find the successful practices in other states and in other domains to address pain points that are similar or identical to your own. And then secondly, and I'm going to bring this topic up again, those states should definitely engage in the discussion of this vision of an open UI platform and how we can work together across states and with newly engaged partners in the domain to change the status quo model of multiple incompatible vendor solutions, monolithic solutions.
Excellent. Amy?
Yeah, I think first I want to go back to one point that Rebecca just made, which I think is really important, which is the employers and the third-party administrators as stakeholders in this system. And I think there is tension there, but I think one of the other pieces that I've gotten to see since I've been out of government is often employer concerns and employer customer experience, and employers as stakeholders are sort of very low down the list of things that matter or are prioritized. And there are ways in which we could get benefits to folks more quickly if we address some pain points on the employer side that I think are not because employers don't want to pay benefits, or are legitimately obstacles in some of the processes. So I'll just say that, happy to talk about that offline. I think pulling things out of New Jersey, I think the leadership factor, the leadership champions, the being in the room, like Jennifer mentioned, this, you can't overstate what that does for a project's legitimacy and momentum. And it means that problems don't grow from little sand in the gears to the whole thing gets stopped. That gets addressed down here instead of when it's out here. And the other piece I would say is, from what it sounds like, New Jersey didn't necessarily know that this was going to be how their modernization unfolded. They started somewhere, and it became clear that this was the right way to move forward. And I think sometimes there's this, like, we have to know everything, and we have to get all of the funding, and we have to make it all, we have to fix all of it in the next 18 months, or the legislature or whoever is not going to be okay with this project. I think thinking about change in a different framework than UI has typically thought about change. Again, it's a bigger conversation, but it takes people who know the policy, it takes people who know technology, and it takes people who have the political capital inside the state to sort of catalyze those conversations. So in addition to everything Ben said on the technical front, I think that ecosystem of leadership is really a critical factor.
Great. So we have 5 minutes left. I want to just do a lightning round, 1 minute of your top takeaways from this conversation. And I will go backward to forward this time and start with Jen. You're on mute.
I'm going to pick up on something that that Amy just said, and recognizing that there is no one definition of agile or one definition of waterfall, and that we're all trying to just get stuff done within the environment that we have and move things in the right direction. I don't believe in silver bullets. And that's one of the things I love about the New Jersey story is it's just, one step at a time. But there's a line that stuck with me for a long time by a friend named Clay Shirky, and it's very anti-waterfall, and it's that the waterfall amounts to a pledge by all parties not to learn anything during the actual work. I think one of the things I just want to pull out is the ways in which learning along the way, which makes it very hard to plan 10 years in advance, gets us better outcomes. And that is certainly something that New Jersey and other states are doing. Please don't take my remark to say that I will judge you if you're still working in a waterfall methodology, but if you can find ways to take those lessons and be learning as you go and create those feedback loops, I think that is hugely helpful to these incredibly difficult problems.
Great. And then Amy?
Yeah, I think I'm struck by the sense of optimism at this moment in the conversation about UI modernization. There's obviously been some setbacks in the past few weeks, but I think there is energy and so much learning happening. And I'm encouraged by the ambitious way states are tackling these issues with the always limited resources and getting pushed out of the spotlight until there's another crisis. But I just want to say that I'm encouraged by that, and I'm excited and cheering on every state that's in the middle of that process.
Great. Steve?
I think to really have the kind of UI system we should have, and as was envisioned in the Social Security Act back in 1935, I mean, there are all kinds of pieces that need to be done. The technologies that we've talked about is extraordinarily important, and it's been neglected for an enormous amount of time. But we have to think about communication systems with claimants, with employers, administrative procedures that are improved and made a good deal simpler, both for adjudicators and for administrative law judges and the legal system, the state legal system, and the federal legal system. And obviously, what I'm pushing is for comprehensive federal UI reform, but with states working to improve their systems before that happens and after it happens.
Great, thank you. And Rebecca?
Yes, I would just want to leave folks with that, all of these backlogs represent real people who are counting on this program as the only program that is there for folks when they're between jobs. And that we need to make sure that we're taking that seriously in everything that we're doing, and that we are working to expand their access and not constrain their access. And that when we do the technological advances to these systems, that we are centering what the customers need and making sure that what we're designing is accessible to them from that standpoint, in addition to all of the things that Stephen talked about related to access and creating a robust program that is that serves all workers, making sure that the changes that we are making, the positive directions we are moving in, that they do center workers and their needs.
Great. And then final word goes to Ben Purse.
Thank you. So clearly New Jersey is on to something here. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all agreed to join you today. And kudos to New Jersey, not only for that, but even with those successes, they've not been shy to share with us what they would do differently. And to emphasize what Jen said, that adaptation and learning is so critical to the future success. The advantages are pretty clear. We deliver value more quickly. We're responsive to changing conditions. However, we've kind of glossed over that there are challenges or risks associated with the agile approach. And I just want to mention two real quickly. One is you do potentially increase the duration of time that you're supporting multiple technologies, which usually comes with increased operational costs. So that's kind of a pretty mechanical thing. And the other is more environmental, which is there's a tendency to leave the hard stuff to last, which is really hard to get over. But there are so many considerations that go beyond the technical and financial. We need to work your network. We need to work our network. The collaboration and the coordination will be key for the future success across our system for the UI programs across the country. Thank you.
Thanks. Carl, did you want to close this out or?
No, just thank you all. It was excellent conversation. I appreciate it very much. I hope that you can stay for the next event with the press.